And I think we could also go on with all of the discourse to the language that Jesus Christ uses later on, where he says, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now, that language is used by those who want to say that Jesus is a false apocalyptic prophet, whether Bart Ehrman or Albert Schweitzer or Bertrand Russell or whoever. That very language is being used to say, look, this has to mean the end of the world. But as you've already alluded to, or maybe even underscored, if you read Scripture in light of Scripture, you find out that this is common language. It's not only used in the book of Revelation by John, who's using it in the same way that Jesus is using it, but it's also used in the Old Testament. You can go to Isaiah chapter 13, and you see that Isaiah uses the exact same language to talk about the Medes putting out the lights or the glories of the Babylonian Empire. The exact same language is used. So it has nothing to do with the end of the world. It's judgment language. And here you have Jesus, the heir to the linguistic riches of the Old Testament prophets, and a far greater prophet than them all. He's employing that language, and now he's applying it to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, again, that takes reading the Bible in light of the Bible. You can give certain skeptics a pass because they just don't know the Bible. But when you have dispensationalists who read the Bible, who tell people to read the Bible, who are constantly giving programs for how to read the Bible in a year's time and so forth, you would assume that they know the language of Scripture, and therefore know that this has nothing to do with the end of the world. It has nothing to do with the stars falling out of the sky. I mean, one star would obliterate the earth, let alone the stars, plural, falling out of the sky. So this is judgment language. I'm trying to get to maybe a question here for you. How in the world can they miss this? It seems so plain and obvious.
It is a mystery to me. In fact, I was reading a commentary by D.A. Carson on Matthew, and he would agree with us all the way up through verse 28. He would say this is dealing with events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in A.D. 70. But when you get to verse 29, this is something that has not taken place yet. But you read the first two words, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. And so verse 29 has to follow immediately after verse 28. Anybody who believes 1 through 28 refers to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which D.A. Carson does, you've got to go with what happens next, and that's immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now, again, I'm using New American Standard, and the New American Standard does a very nifty thing with its translation. Every time there's a quotation from the Old Testament, it puts it in small capital letters. And verse 29, verse 30, verse 31 are almost all small caps, which means that what the translators of the New American Standard Bible are doing, they are seeing these things Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament. And as you mentioned, that passage from Isaiah chapter 13, but you also find it in Ezekiel chapter 32, 1 through 8.
Joel, there are many examples.
Yeah, it's all over the prophets. And the question is, why? The sun, moon, and stars language. Remember, Jesus is dealing with the destruction of the temple. Jesus is dealing with the old covenant age is passing away. Why would he pick this particular passage? I think there are two reasons. Number one is that Israel in the Old Testament is described as sun, moon, and stars. All you have to do is look at Genesis chapter 37 in Joseph's dream about the sun, moon, and the 11 stars bowing down to him. And then I think the second part is here, this is probably a little more controversial, but I believe Jesus is identifying apostate Israel at this particular point in history as New Testament Babylon. It's taking up the characteristics of Babylon as the persecutor of the people of God and so forth, and attempting to put them into captivity and so forth. So Jesus takes language that was attributed to Babylon in Isaiah chapter 13 and then says this applies to what we're dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. That language is used for Jerusalem. In fact, if you get to the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 12, that woman who gives birth she's standing on the moon, she's clothed with the sun, she's got 12 stars. That is a description when the stars are bright in the sky and the sun is shining and the moon is bright, that's a sign of blessing. But when the sun goes dark and the moon goes dark and the stars fall, that is a sign of judgment. And once again, we're seeing judgment language here.
Yeah, so let's talk about another phrase in the Olivet Discourse, and we've certainly mentioned it in passing, but I want to focus in on this phrase because it seems like it's right at the epicenter of the dispensational argument. And it's the phrase, this generation. The dispensationalist cannot read that in the sense in which it's intended. They have to look at this and they have to use all kinds of games to get around this. Jesus is saying this generation, well, the dispensationalist says, well, Jesus didn't really mean this when he said this. He meant that. Or they say generation doesn't really mean generation. Generation really means race. Talk about this game, this semantical game that's being played on the part of dispensationalists, John Hagee. I mean, you can name 100 very, very prominent people that you listen to on radio, television, read about in Christian magazines. They play this game all the time.
They do, and it was really popularized in the Scofield Reference Bible, where C.I. Scofield claimed that the Greek word genea, which is translated elsewhere as generation, can also mean race. And again, you don't have to be a Greek scholar to do this. And so here's what I tell people to do. That word in Matthew chapter 24:34, generation, let's see how the Bible translates that. What does it mean? So let's take Scofield's race translation and go to the first time you find the Greek word genea in the Gospel of Matthew. And then it is in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17. Now let's plug the word race in here every time the Greek word genea is found. So here I go. Therefore, all the races from Abraham to David are 14 races, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 races, and from the deportation to Babylon to the time of Christ, 14 races. Well, that makes absolutely no sense. So let's plug the actual meaning is, therefore, all the generations. The only word that makes sense in that passage is, in fact, the word generation. This does not mean a race. And the other problem with it is it's the wrong Greek word. The Greek word here is genea, but the Greek word for race is genos. I mean, they look and sound a lot alike. There are English words that are like that too, but they don't mean the same thing. Jesus was talking about a particular period of time, generation. And in this case, that particular generation, because what you've got there is the near demonstrative this. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. If Jesus had a future generation in mind, he would have said that generation will not pass away until all these things take place.
So Jesus is not linguistically challenged.
Yeah. If anybody knows his grammar and his vocabulary and what words mean, it's Jesus. And so you're right. There's this kind of, I called it silly putty exegesis. They want to stretch something to fit their particular position. And so Tim LaHaye and Tommy Ice, in a book they did together, here's how they translated this. The generation that sees these signs will not pass away until all these things take place. So they got rid of the word this, and they added the and sees these signs to the text in order to get it to mean what it says. But okay, let's take that. Let's say what Jesus really meant here is the generation that sees these signs will not pass away until all these things take place. I'll go with that. So look at verse 33, the verse just before this. Notice the audience reference. Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near right at the door, or it is near right at the door. So Jesus is saying the people who are living and hearing this, when they see these things, recognize that these things take place. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. There's no getting around that Jesus is referring to that particular generation. And, there's a lot to lose in coming to this particular position, because so many books, so many radio shows, so many TV shows, so many articles, so many ministries are based upon the premise that what Jesus is describing in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21 is an end-time scenario. And the thing of it is, it's hard to sell books dealing with prophecies that have already taken place. It's easier to sell books describing what's going to take place in the future. It's like playing the stock market. If I had a really great stock and said, hey, Hank, I'm going to tell you about a stock I made $1 million on, you might say, well, that's great, Gary, but tell me some stocks that I can make $1 million on. And so there's not a lot of sensationalism in describing events that already took place, but there's a great deal of sensationalism and a book-buying public that buys into sensationalism by attempting to show what's going to happen in the future. And so to change a prophetic position is difficult for people because there's so much wrapped up in that particular prophetic position. And I know people who have changed their prophetic position and have lost literally $1 million. I debated Kent Hovind, who still believes in the 7-year tribulation period, but he went from a pre-trib to a pre-wrath position. And he told me, he says, he just by taking that position, not denying a rapture, not denying the 7-year tribulation period, but just saying, I don't believe the Bible teaches a pre-trib rapture. I believe it teaches a pre-wrath rapture. He said he lost $1 million in donation. Imagine taking the position that this has nothing to do with the 7-year future tribulation period, but this is a past prophetic event. People are, they have a lot to lose by changing a position that is so, to me, self-evident.